I'm Ann Dark.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
Welcome back to another edition of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club. On today's episode, we have a very interesting interview with Lou Berney, who wrote the amazing book November Road. But first, we wanted to talk a little bit about what we've been up to.
We've had a fun day. We took a ride out to the first annual Upper Chesapeake Pride Festival, and boy, was it a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. They had a great drag show, and the community came together. It was just a great day of love and togetherness.
It sure was. And we ate way too much ice cream.
Yes, this is in Havre de Grace, Maryland. If you're ever in the area, it's right on the water, and it's a beautiful little town on the very top of the Chesapeake Bay. They have an ice cream shop there called Bomb Boys, which sells chocolates and homemade ice cream. And Kathy and I each had a banana split, and it
did us in.
It definitely did us in. And Anne just had a sundae. She was the smarter of the three. Okay, so we're going to get into the Lou Berney interview.
Lou Berney is the best-selling author of the novels November Road, named one of the best books of 2018 by the Washington Post, The Long and Far Away Gone, winner of the Edgar Award, Whiplash River, and Guns Shot Straight, all from William Morrow. He's also published a collection of short stories, The Road to Bobby Joe, and his short fiction has appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, Plowshares, and the Pushcart Prize Anthology. November Road is set against the assassination of JFK, a poignant and evocative crime novel that centers on a desperate cat-and-mouse chase across 1960s America, a story of unexpected connections, daring possibilities, and the hope of second chances from the Edgar Award-winning author of The Long and Far Away Gone. Frank Guidry's luck has finally run out.
We would like to introduce to the show Lou Berney, who wrote the fascinating book November Road. Welcome, Lou.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. Where did you get your inspiration for November Road?
Probably the main source of inspiration for November Road was my mother, who character of Charlotte in the book is definitely inspired by my mom, who passed away several years ago. My mom grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, was very poor with her family on Highway 66 to California during the Depression. I always just wondered what her life would have been like if she had taken a different path and made different choices. And that really fueled the journey of Charlotte in the book, this idea of like what happens if you throw away one life and run toward another one.
Oh, wow. So you intermingled some actual characters with fictional ones. Was there an actual person you based Frank Guidry on?
Frank is not really based on an actual person. I went to college in New Orleans, so I'm fairly familiar with the city. Frank is, to me, a representation of the stuff I love about New Orleans. And the people there are really friendly. They're really charming, very likable. And so I thought of a mob guy from New Orleans would be very different than a mob guy from Chicago or New York. So Frank kind of evolved into a different sort of character. He's not a killer per se. He's amoral, but he's also very charming. He's likable, and he's sort of has the gift of conversation and of making friends. And that to me is sort of quintessentially New Orleans, where, you know, you could spend 10 minutes in that city and you'll make 10 friends.
That's true. I was in New Orleans quite a bit, and you hit that nail on the head. You seem to enjoy writing about anti-heroes like Frank Guidry and Sheikh Bouchan. Is there a thin line between good versus evil, and how do you find the balance to make us care so much about them?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it's something I'm not sure I was entirely aware of when I was writing these characters. And I think sometimes it's good for a writer not to be aware of what's happening, you know, behind the curtain in a sense. But I think for me, there's definitely a difference between evil and amoral or evil and a little bit criminal. And so I think my characters like Frank and like Shay aren't evil guys. They're bad guys, but they have the capability to change and they have the possibility of becoming something better. And to me, that's what's most interesting. I definitely like antagonists to be evil or really, really bad. But for the main characters, I like this idea of a character in flux, a character who's a little bit gray. So the central question of a novel becomes, is he or she going to go to the dark side or to the light side? And that's always been kind of interesting to me.
It is. And I think you did just a brilliant job of writing Frank. I don't think I've ever rooted for a bad guy so much in a book.
Oh, that's great to hear. I'm so glad to hear that.
Now, I heard you hated your first attempt at writing November Road and threw out the version and started over. What was so horrible about the first attempt, and what did you change to bring it to the published version?
Well, it wasn't exactly horrible, the first version, but it was wrong. And it was wrong for me. Looking back on it, it was about 6 months of work I threw out. It was good stuff. It was a good novel, but it just wasn't my novel. And I think the biggest thing for me was how static it was. Like, the original version of this novel, power novel, was set in a small town where a mafia guy had gone to sort of hide out after a job. And it just felt like suffocating to me to write scene after scene in a small town. And it felt like the characters didn't have room to grow. For me, putting both Charlotte and Frank on the road, running from something and running towards something, opened up so many possibilities in terms of the narrative and in terms of the story and the side characters. Once I did that, it just started flowing in a way that before then it had been just really like squeezing blood from a stone every day when I went to write.
I can see how that would be really stifling.
And again, I think that's, for some writers, that's great. And I think it would have been a good novel for someone else. But I think every writer has to find what works for him or her. For me, that was sort of the journey, is discovering like, oh yeah, that doesn't work, so I know now what does work. And sometimes I think failure precedes success, and you kind of have to make mistakes in order to figure out what really works.
Boy, is that true.
Yeah, right.
Well, I personally love the character of Charlotte. I also share her love of photography, and I had hoped that she would wind up pursuing that dream, and yet she didn't. You chose to have her become an administrator. Why didn't you have her follow her dream of photography?
I thought about it. At the end of the day, I decided that it just felt a little too neat for her to all of a sudden become a successful photographer or a famous photographer, because life doesn't really work like that, where your dreams come exactly true. Your dreams might come true in a way that you didn't really expect. And for Charlotte, the main thing was having a new life, having a fresh life, and having opportunities. And so I think she loved her job working for the studios in Hollywood and being in the marketing department. And it wasn't photography, but it was something that she would have never, ever had the chance to do unless she had left her husband and left her small town. So I think in the big picture for her, it was a huge win. And I just kind of wanted to preserve that without making it seem too easy or too trite, that she got exactly the specifics of what she wanted. Because I find, as someone who's been through a lot of life, I find generally the best things that happen to you aren't exactly what you expect. I kind of wanted that to be the same for Charlotte.
Well, I have to say the end of the book was just so well done, and you wrapped things up beautifully without giving any details. I sat there after I finished the book and just kind of absorbed it. It was just beautiful.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. That makes me so happy. Ends of books are always hard, I think, for every writer, and for me, definitely. I know I can speak from personal experience that it's a lot of trial and error. And for me, it's sort of trying out, does this work? Does it feel right? And if it doesn't feel right, I try something else. And it's really hard to stick a landing, I think, with a novel, particularly when you have a lot of different characters and a lot of different themes going on. So I'm glad that you had that. I felt good with the way the novel ended. And I want to satisfy the reader's expectations, but also surprise the reader in a lot of ways, too. And that's a tough balancing act to do.
I can imagine. November Road had a very stylized feel to it. How did you channel the 60s so brilliantly?
I was born in 1964. So I was writing about an era I didn't know at all, which I realized very quickly was a difficult challenge. What I ended up doing for the first month or so of writing, I think, I would write a sentence and throw it out, write another sentence and throw it out, because it just didn't sound like 1963. It sounded like 2016 or whenever I was writing the book. And so one thing that really helped was I went on eBay and I bought back issues of a lot of magazines from 1963. I bought every issue of Good Housekeeping and every issue of Playboy, boxes and boxes coming to my house. Because I actually wanted to look at the words on the page. I wanted to look at the ads in the magazine. I just immersed myself in 1963 for several months. Got to know the rhythm of the language, the word choice, what people were thinking about, what they were preoccupied with. And it's funny, by the end of the process of this novel, I was like really fluent in 1963. I would say to my wife, like, honey, where's the percolator? And she'd be like, the what? And it was like really having to learn another language. The best way of time traveling back was through these magazines and just reading every word and looking at every ad and every picture.
What a great idea.
Fantastic. I would have never thought of that.
In 1963, of course, the big event was the Kennedy assassination. And I know November Road is not about that, but you write about the mob involvement as though it's a fact in the book. Is that your opinion, or is that creative license?
I would say that's creative license. As you said, I didn't want to write a book about the Kennedy assassination, but I also knew I needed a plausible scenario, so I did a ton of research, even though I might now still come down on the side that Oswald acted alone. I think it's very plausible that if anyone else was involved, it was Carlos Marcello and the New Orleans mob. But there's a lot of pretty strong evidence toward that interpretation. During the book, I just wanted to come straight at it and not even make it about a conspiracy. Just like you said, it's just a fact in the book. Like, this is what happened. But at the same time, it's not something that's just pulled out of thin air. There's a basis for that. Like everything, Carlos Marcello was a real character. He was the most dangerous man in America in the 1960s and 1950s. Everything about him is true in the book. He was certainly capable of arranging something like this. So I tried to strike that balance as I was writing the book.
That kind of leads to the next question. I guess you had to do a lot of research about the Kennedy assassination. Is that something you're fascinated by, or is it a hobby of yours?
Well, it was definitely something that surprised me. I did a lot of research. One thing that surprised me was how many different theories there are about the assassination. Like, I'd always heard, yeah, there's the grassy knoll, but there's literally dozens of different conspiracy theories about who really killed Kennedy, who was really behind it. It was the Soviets, it was LBJ, it was the Chicago mob, it was the Miami mob, it was the New Orleans mob, it was the aliens. That was one of my favorites, that Kennedy, this is a real theory. People will battle to the death that soon before he was shot, Kennedy discovered Area 51 in New Mexico where all the UFOs are kept, and so the aliens had to kill him. It's an incredible amount of crazy and reasonable theories too. What I found the most interesting when I was researching this was the facts themselves are even more fascinating than the theories. So there's things like the morning that Kennedy was shot, he and Jackie Kennedy stayed in Fort Worth at a hotel, and that morning Kennedy woke up and he said to Jackie, witnessed this, he said, you know, it wouldn't be hard at all to kill the president. You would have to get someone with a rifle at a high place, and there's nothing anyone could do to stop that person. There's a lot of great little details like that are true, that are to me more interesting than all the wild theories.
There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, and there is some validity to a lot of them, and I don't think we're ever going to know the real answer.
Another fact that's interesting to me is that the president's brain was removed during the autopsy. That should tell us exactly where the angle of the bullet struck his brain. But the brain disappeared in 1966 from the National Archives, vanished without a trace. Again, that's a fact, not a theory. The brain vanished from the National Archives, which I just think is incredible. And so there's a lot of these questions that will never be answered, as you say.
Well, that just feeds all the conspiracy.
Exactly.
We noticed that there's an IMDb credit for November Road. Can you talk about that?
It's being developed right now into a feature film, but as with all things in Hollywood, you can never be certain until it is actually on the screen. So I try not to pay too much attention to what's happening with the development process, which is raising the money, finding the cast, a fluid process with people dropping in and out, money dropping in and out. I think there's been a lot of great excitement about the project, so I hope sooner than later it'll make its way to the big screen.
Well, here's an impromptu question. If you were to cast the movie, who would you cast as Frank and Charlotte?
You know, I'm terrible at answering that question. They're real people to me, and I lived with them for so long, and they were in my head for so long. It's almost impossible for me to think of who would play them. It's like saying who would play your mother or who would play your brother. So I'd love to hear what other people's ideas are, but I can never come up with an answer to that myself, unfortunately.
I get it. That's what we hear over and over again with these writers, is that these people are real to them, and they're like part of their family.
Yeah, they're really real. I mean, they live on and they're part of my brain and my neurochemistry in a way that's permanent, I think.
This was a standalone novel. I can't imagine it becoming a series.
No.
But do you have any new books or events coming up that you'd like our listeners